beginning of time, we have asked, who are we? You know, what happened before the Big Bang and what's going to happen after the universe ends. And pretty much I'm going to present to you some possibilities. I don't have the answers. I'm just a human being like everybody else. I don't think one person has the answer. I think we all have the answer. I think every single one of us in this room is sitting here because we're a part of something. And I don't know if everybody knows everybody in here, but I hope you've taken the opportunity since you've been here to meet new friends, because I think it is very important, and I found out it's very important for myself to talk to other people and talk about your experiences, because I think that's how we find the answers. Somebody said to me one time, he who unlocks the secrets of the universe holds the keys to the future of mankind, and I really do believe that. So I'm Kathleen Andersen with an E. I was born in Connecticut. I lived in Connecticut. I'm a New Englander. Lived in Los Angeles, traveled around the country. I've worked in newspaper, television, good things like that. Unfortunately, it doesn't pay to be a writer. In the United States, it's one of the lowest paying jobs in the country, so I do have a mortgage business, which is when times get economically bad in the United States, people need money. They need to keep taking more money out of their house. So that's what I do. And as I said, I'm here to just present information, not to make any conclusions. I'm trying to find the answers just like everybody else. If I say 99 things, or 100 things, and I say one thing that you haven't heard before, then maybe I've said something to help you. So on June 24th, approximately 3 o'clock in 1947, a pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold was flying, and if I'm in your way, let me know. A pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold was flying from Oregon to his home in Idaho when a glint of light caught his eye. And as you probably all know the story, he reported 9 flying objects over Mount Rainier, which is 14,410 feet. The press got a hold of the story because Kenneth Arnold was part of the sheriff's deputy, and it started a UFO frenzy that is continuing to this day from 1947. The name Flying Saucer came about because one of the objects that Kenneth had seen, obviously, was around and skipped on the air like a flying saucer. But if we go back and say, is this the beginning of ufology? No, I don't think it's the beginning of ufology. I think ufology has been with us for a very, very long time. This is Mount Rainier. It's a very large mountain. It comes out of sea level and goes up high. About 3 years ago, I was talking to somebody, and they said, you really need to look at the history. You really need to look at history. And I said, I don't really want to look at history. I don't like history. History is not, geography I like. History is not one of my favorite subjects. And they said, you have to look at history, because maybe the key to what's going on now is in history. Because I said, well, I want to know what they're doing here. I want to know who the Greys are. What's UFOs? What do they want? What's their agenda? You know, I want it right here. I'm an Aries, so I tend to be impetuous. So I started doing some digging. I've always been a Zecharia Sitchin fan, but I kept going through, and I didn't grow up with the Bible, but I started to digging into holy books, not just the Bible, but the Kabbalah and other mythology. I'm Celtic, I'm Irish, and said, you know, maybe if we take mythology, archaeology, and these holy books, maybe they all come down to one source. And maybe the stories that we hear have some clue to who we are, and who are we, and what's happening here. So, you know, we all know Ezekiel and Elijah and Moses. They've had some contact with gods, and I always say gods with little g, and that's not to offend anybody that is religious here, but I do believe there was gods with little g's, because the gods with the little g's had the capacity to fly in the sky. And if you look at some of the stuff that was written, and as I said, I'm a pupil of Zecharia Sitchin. I took his last class that he held, accreditation, so I could teach his material. But I didn't want to be controversial, because Zecharia Sitchin, let's face it, is a man. He's just like everybody else, what does he know? I mean, he's just going to interpret everything. So I started doing a lot of research at the cuneiform writings of Oxford University, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Chicago, and said, how do the scholars look at what happened in the past? And who are these gods? What were they flying in? You know, what were they doing up there? So we go down and we realize when we start looking at the commonality of stories that the gods have the same characteristics as we do. I mean, they're very similar. They had 2 arms, 2 legs. And that they had the same characteristics that we do. You know, they experienced love, the Inanna thing, love and hate and war. They were jealous, they ate, they had sex, and they drank beer. They liked all the indulgences that we do as humans do. Now, a lot of people see the depictions that are sitting in Iraq right now, and isn't that funny? You know, we talk about kind of the coincidence. It says to me, well, the Mesopotamian Valley is some of the oldest in the world, and yet the United States has chosen to go over there and have a war. And of course, I was always, my biggest thing was, I was, well, wait a minute here, what's going on there? There's some wonderful artifacts that could be lost through this whole thing. So a lot of people think that the big, you know, I come across people and they say, they think that basically from the writings we've had from the Sumerians, that the Sumerians are the big, tall, bearded beings that were there, and they're not, of course. Those are the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The Sumerians sprang into the Mesopotamian Valley about 5000 BC. No one knows where they came from. If you look at mainstream archaeology, they don't know. Some people say they came from the sea. So pretty much what we do know from archaeology in Oxford University, University of Pennsylvania, and Chicago, not Zachariah Sitchin, is that they came with them and brought us a culture. They actually gave us the wheel, astronomy, astrology, how to build roads, how to harvest grains, everything that man would know to survive. And they also brought with us very, very interesting stories, including one tale of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, as probably everybody knows, if you read it, please, if you can find a copy of the Book of Enoch, read it and find out that there's, if you take that basis of what was left to us in writing, our first forms of writing later became things that we interpret in the Bible. There's a game when you're a child in the United States called telephone. And telephone is that somebody tells a story here and that person passes it down and they call and they call and they call and they call. By the time we started with this story and by the time we end up with this story, it has a lot of interpretation and meaning. And that's pretty much how I feel about what's happened to anything we read. It's interpretation of man. And let's face it, I'm a writer and I know that when I write something, you put a little bit of your own ego in there. So you say, what does Sumerians have to do with UFOs? I think they have a lot to do with UFOs. Because they left us a tale of gods, little g gods, that were in the sky and they could fly. They came down from the heavens. As we know with Ezekiel, they came with the fiery chariots, the wheels. There's a good book out, I don't know if you can even find it anymore. I think it's called The Gemini Project. It's a really rare book. Maybe Bill Chucker has that in his library. It was written by a Gemini engineer who actually took apart the Bible, and he was a designer of one of the Gemini projects for NASA, and said that there's so many commonalities in how to build a rocket that go into space versus what you see in the Bible. You just have to look. So what they left us, the Sumerians, they told us a tale of the Anunnaki. And somebody brought a good point up a couple of years ago, and they said the Anunnaki were actually the givers of life. They were the gods that gave us life, that created us. And we all know that the Egyptians had the Ankh. Well, Egyptians don't say Ankh. And Ankh is A-N-K-H. Anunnaki. So if you look at Anunnaki, who are the Egyptians talking about? The Anunnaki that gave us life, because that's what the Ankh is, key of life. So you say, okay, what does this have to do about UFOs? Well, we still have gods in the sky. Oops, I just want to see if you're awake. There's the back of my Australian cattle dog, Can Do, and horses. I'm a horse person. So we go on from the Sumerians, because you remember, if you listen to the tales of the Sumerians, they told about that the gods were here. Why were the gods here? They were here, they came to visit. They had a crew of workers. They were here for gold. They were processing gold. If you look at, a lot of you probably read about monatomic gold, and people are always in search of monatomic gold, which the gods had, which they converted gold into powder. And they ingested, and it opened their pineal gland and made them radiant. And if you listen to the story of Noah, he was born with very radiant eyes. And his father, Lamech, is it, thought, wait a minute here, he must be part God. So we move on to the story of how we were created, and we're coming up to the future here. And we look at whatever evidence we have in the United States right now, and we have what we call glyphs, petroglyphs that are around the country. This is in Washington State, and of course the Native Americans say the same story. Actually, their story in most of Western Washington, Native Americans say that they actually came from a big shell in the sky. And the shell landed and all these little people came out. So you think, Now, I'm curious about this photo because I'd like to know if it corresponds with anything that's in Australia. No? Yes, maybe? These are on the Columbia River. And I talked about how the Anunnaki were supposedly, if you listen to the Sumerians, talked about the Anunnaki were gods from heaven that basically ingested gold and could have they had radiant rays coming off of them. So I started doing some research about, these are petroglyphs on the Columbia River. And if you always notice in the United States, you'll see a lot of our old petroglyphs have these radiant beings. And you know, if you look at archaeologists, they say, oh, because they were gods. And I go, what does that have to do with? No, I don't understand the connection. And bouncing down to the Anasazi, I went down there about 10 years ago, no, less than 10 years ago. And I went on a tour of all the pueblos and everything like that, and they said, oh, the Anasazi, they disappeared, and they used to wear these clothes over here, and they had all the sophisticated plumbing and these kivas, and they had a religion and everything. And then they ran out in the desert and they lived in a tent. And I go, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would they have all the sophisticated stuff, and why would they go be living in a teepee after that? So I said to the ranger, I said, well, how do you know what they look like if you don't have any skeletons? And he said, it's all hypothesis. I said, that makes a little more sense. You're just conjuring up what you think. Archaeologists, no blast on archaeologists here, but you're only saying that, you know, this is logical. So I've never been a person that would, you know, take what somebody tells me as gospel. Now, going back to Washington State, because I'm going to cut this down really short, the Yakima Reservation, I don't know if a lot of people have heard about Mount Adams, Yakima Reservation. It's a very mysterious place in Washington State. For years and years and years, we've had earth lights. Paul Devereaux has done a lot of research there, Greg Long. We don't know what goes on there. There's 125,000 acres of wilderness that you can't get into. There's a lot of rumblings underground. There's earth light. There's things that look like spaceships coming out of remote areas that nobody could, big cities coming out of the ground. Columns of light, fires that look like fires. Really weird sounds, Bigfoot sightings. And we're talking about, we'll jump to Bigfoot Valley. One of the recent cases that I have, and you know, Travis, you have the courage to get up here on stage, but you know, as a researcher, and I'm state director for MUFON for Washington State and also on the board of MUFON, a lot of people just never do come to us. And when they come to us, they don't give us their permission to tell their story. But if you look at the commonality, I have never seen a UFO. I don't know, probably everybody in this room has seen a UFO. I can find out the commonality is that there's a lot of information, Bill Chalker probably knows this, and Roger, a lot of information that actually comes up in cases that we can't divulge, number one. And number two, there's just too much in common with other people. You know, that doesn't make sense. You go, how did this person have the same information as this person. So one of the cases I just did recently is in the Bigfoot Valley. I don't know how the Bigfoot Valley got its name. Nobody's ever seen a Bigfoot. But there was a couple looking out in bed, and they saw this mountain, and down comes one sphere, but I kind of had to put it in the direction. And it shoots down, and then shoots back up again. And I'm bringing up the sphere because in the United States, a lot of our sightings right now are more globe-type golden spheres, which was a sign of, I think, talk when you come right down to it. If you look, this comes from the National UFO Reporting Center, and Peter Davenport would be very upset with me if I didn't tell you to go get his brochure out that I put on the table there in his business card, and check out his website. But we're getting an awful lot of this over the past, especially the past year. And if you think about aviation, I'm not a pilot, that if you're going to develop some kind of flying machine to go around, I guess a round globe would be the perfect thing to get around in. You wouldn't have to go forward or backwards easily. We had another golden orb that came. I had to use that graphic, but come down. We've had a couple of them in Washington State now. I don't know what's going on. I really don't, but I know something is going on. Another lot of reports that we get is iridium satellites. I don't know if you get iridium satellites here, do you? They basically go across and then they flare up when they catch the suns. We get a lot of reports from there. So we go back to Travis's experience and everybody else's experience, and you say, what is going on here? You know, and I heard somebody actually mention about Travis's nationality. I'm a big fan of Sir Lawrence Gardner also, and you look at, you know, what could be possible? What if there was a civilization of gods, and they had to leave the planet, which they did, we know they had to leave. Unfortunately, man took over, kind of made a whole mess of things, changed things. So did they leave behind possibly the watchers? And what are they watching for? What are they looking for? Travis and I were talking about DNA, and we were saying that, you know, we're just finding out so many things about DNA now. What are they going to find out? Like, they were saying there's so many strands in the DNA chain that don't mean anything. And we all agreed, and Jerry was saying, do they really not mean anything, or do they really, we just don't understand what they mean? And is everybody in here, and this sounds horrible, but is everybody in here possibly in here for a reason? Maybe you're not out watching rugby or football. Maybe you're in here because you're a descendant of something that was here, and maybe you are being monitored. And that's how we look at it at MUFON. We're finding out there was some statistics we just released, and I don't know if you're going to read about them too much unless you get the MUFON journal. And over all the years that we've done cases, we have found that on the abduction scenario, there's actually 3 types of situations. There's people that actually participate. There's people that are willing participants. There's people, I have had dreams about this, so that's why it's kind of creepy in a sense. There's actually people that help other people, like, come on, come over here. And there's people that go unwillingly or don't understand that they're part of it. And so we have to question, is part of the whole abduction a DNA study? Are we being watched? Are we descendants? There is a high amount of Celtic people and Celtic backgrounds that do fall under abductions. I don't know why, but that's a fact. That's an absolute fact. There is statistics. I can't mention them because if I start mentioning them, I may offend certain groups, but there is information. MUFON, we're not, in the United States, we're not going to be having meetings so much anymore. We're actually more of a publishing company from here on in over the next year. They have all the database for APRO and MUFON since the 50s. All those things are being archived and they will be online. And MUFON will be selling that time to go back to every case that we have. And they have something like 1.2 million pages of reports that will be available to the public. It's not a big hole like everybody thinks. So in conclusion, you know, where does this all fall? Where do they come from? Okay, Okay, so if there is aliens or whatever, where do they come from? Time travel. The one commonality I was talking to Travis about was about 2 years ago, a scientist by the name of Lujan Wang used particles and got them beyond the speed of light by using a form of radon gas. In the Bigfoot Valley, there's large deposits of uranium and radon gas. Travis was saying that there is radon gas, not radon gas, but there's uranium up in your mountains too. So you have to think possible, okay, here's a possibility. Could whatever is coming into our system or wherever they're coming from possibly be able to, are they using radon gas to go beyond the speed of light? Rudy Rucker, a physicist in the 1980s, said that if you were, his theory was, and he didn't write about UFOs, he's writing about physics, if you were living on level 1, you may not know there's a level 5 if you didn't have a way to get there. So possibly life is a lot more complex and a little more multidimensional than we'd like to say. I did an interview with Michio Kaku a couple of years ago, and of course his theory is that everything moves, everything is vibrating in continual perpetual motion in space. If you might be a C string, you might not know there's a D string next to you. If you were broadcasting on 101.1, you might not know there's life at 98.5, which makes a lot more sense. We go back to John Mack. Our experiences that people have internal. Is the mind so powerful that we can actually create things? I'm a firm believer in that. When we talked about the Sumerians coming from the ocean, did they come from civilizations that were lost? And maybe these civilizations like Atlantis or whatever, maybe they did exist. I'm a firm believer the Earth is a lot older, civilization is a lot older than we do. Or the last thing is life more just all of the above. It's more complex than we could ever imagine. There's an article in May issue of Scientific American that says, if you haven't read the article, it's really good. And it says that after the Big Bang, scientists are now saying that possibly we formed in parallel universes. And if you look at some of the ancients, they were trying to tell us about geometry, sacred geometry, mathematics, maybe is the key to where we come from. It's a really good article. And basically, maybe they were trying to say that if these balls were in perpetual motion, and this was our universe, and this was the next universe, and these they don't always simultaneously are not next to each other. So it's not a light year thing. It's possibly a wormhole time, a way to get over the time. And there we are. Kenneth Arnold, before he died, said, and he didn't want that experience. He said, if I had to do this over again, I would never do this again. I would never have told anybody about these UFOs. But he basically said, in my experience, that everyone, no matter what part they play in our existence, has a special purpose, a special task, or a special reason for being what they are and what they are doing. Perhaps it is a personal reason, merely to add to your own experience, or mental growth, our ability to become a functional part of society, which may be far more vast than we dream. And I am a firm believer of that. I think everybody in this room basically is a part of something. And I think that's why it's so good to be here and exchange ideas. My analogy to people that are skeptics, not us in here, because I think we're here for a reason. But I tell people, until we invented the microscope, we didn't know there was a whole universe of microscopic things. And if you've never seen a parasite or something under the microscope, you have to take it for granted that something does exist. So I don't know why there's skeptics out there and when they say something doesn't exist, because things do exist. Until we invented the telescope, we couldn't see that there was universes far beyond our eyesight. So I have to say, I just tell people, just because you can't see it, taste it, or smell it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Things do exist. And I think that when we'll find a way maybe to see that maybe life is all around us. Maybe we're interacting in this room with a whole other dimension that is going the same time we do. Maybe planets, there is life on there. We just can't see them. And with that, I'd just like to